Hello everyone, this is Sophia again from the Department of Sociology, Salesian College, Sonada. And this lesson is for the students of DSc, Sociology of India, second semester. The topic of the lesson is Women's Movement in India. This is your second session. In the first session, we have already completed the part 1, that is the historical background of position of women in Indian society. And in this session, I'll be talking about the different phases of women's movement in India. Before starting with the different phases of women's movement, let us just go in brief about the previous lesson which we have covered. In the last session, we have talked about the position of women in the Vedic period, position of women during the medieval period, and the position of women during the British period. And we have understood in the Vedic period the position of women was good, but the things started deteriorating in the medieval period after the coming of the Islam rulers. And similarly, during the British period also, the position of women was not good. Now we'll be talking about the different phases of women's movement in India, and we'll try to understand the things in a deeper manner here. So let us talk about the phase 1, which I've already mentioned earlier, that is from 1850 to 1915. That is social reform movement of 19th century. So women's movement in India began as the social reform movement. So you might be wondering here, how is that possible? How is this social reform movement and women's movement are interrelated to each other? In 19th century, the status of women was quite low, and the social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Kesab Chandra Sen, Dayanand Saraswati, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, M.G. Ranade, and there are other names also. And they felt in order to make the Indian society a better society, it is important or it is mandatory to uplift the status of women. So these social reformers, they fought for the cause of the women folk. So they fought against the social evils like sati, child marriage. They fought for widow remarriage, women's education. They fought against a system like polygamy, parda system. And Raja Ram Mohan Roy's contribution in the abolition of sati along with Lord Bentinck cannot be denied here. Another important figure which we find here is Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He fought for widow remarriage, and he also fought against the evil practices like child marriage. Dayanand Saraswati, who founded Arya Samaj in the year 1875, he also emphasized on education of both girls and boys. In the same manner, M.G. Ranade and Vandarkar also supported for women's education. The efforts of Vidyasagar, Kesab Chandra Sen, D.K. Karve resulted in Widow Remarriage Act of 1856, which was the big milestone for the women of India. And in year 1891, Age of Consent Act was passed, which raised the legal age of marriage from 10 to 12 for girls. So prior to that, before 1891, Indian girls were married at a very early age, like 8, 9, 10, at the age where they were supposed to play with their toys, play with the pencil and a pen. They had to marry and look after their husband's household. So the contribution and the efforts of the social reformers of 19th century cannot be taken for granted. So in this way, the social reform movement laid foundation for women's movement in India. Unlike the women's movement which took place globally, women's movement in India was first initiated by men rather than the women. Now let us talk about the second phase, that is from 1915 to 1947, freedom struggle movement of 20th century. The expansion of women's education and the admission to the educational institution had produced the sizable amount of the English educated middle class section. So after the partition of Bengal in 1905, Swadeshi movement started in India. But obviously there was the absence of mass awakening among women, but meetings were arranged, meetings were organized by women, and also the khadi spinning was taken up by the women folk. And the period 1911 to 1918 is of great significance because Annie Besant, she led the national movement as the president of Indian National Congress. And during this period, various women's organizations were set up. For example, Women's Indian Association 1917, National Council of Women in India 1920, All India Women's Conference 1926. This organization fought for the women's political rights and also for the education of women. The entry of Mahatma Gandhi altered the national politics dramatically, and during the Gandhian era, many women came in the forefront and participated in the nationalist movement openly. For example, due to the women's effort or struggle, women for the first time exercised their voting rights in the election of 1926. The first woman to stand for election was Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. She later on addressed meeting and picketed foreign clothes and liquor shop during the civil disobedience movement of 1930. In the same manner, Sarojini Naidu, she also took active participation in Dandi March. And in the last phase of the nationalist movement, that is the Quit India movement of 1942, where most of the male leaders were arrested and they were behind the bars. At that point of time, women, they took charge of nationalist movement and they came in the forefront and they fought for the nation. But one thing which we need to keep in our mind is that most of the women who participated in the nationalist movement belonged from the upper caste family and also from the higher class section. Now let us talk about the last phase of women's movement in India, that is the women's movement in the post-independence era, that is after 1947. After independence, the objectives of women's movement focusing on the arenas like inequality in workforce, fair treatment at home. They are fighting against unjust family laws, campaign against domestic violence, reproductive rights of women, and they are also fighting for sex selective abortion, anti-liquor movements, examples from Andhra Pradesh, Manipur, where women fought against alcoholism. Not only that, women are also actively participating in the environmental movements. And even in the past days, women also participated in the environmental movements like Chipko movement, Save Silent Valley movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, or in the EPICO movement. And very recent women's movement like Nirbhaya movement, Me Too movement, Stop Acid Cell movement, these are the important movement which deserves the special mention here. And there are various women's organizations or the NGOs which are fighting for the cause of the women. Not only that, government is also undertaking various kind of steps in order to empower the women folk. One interesting turning point which we see in the post-independence women's movement is that women from all walks of life, women from the Dalit section, women from the tribal section, women from the poorer section, higher class, upper caste, they all are coming in the forefront and fighting for their rights, which indicates that women are becoming conscious about their existence. They are becoming aware of their rights. But sadly, even today, women are the victims of several factors. They are the marginalized section. They are subjugated. They are not treated properly, not only in their household but also in their workplaces. They are the victims of rape, molestation, human trafficking, forced labors, and even today they are denied for education. And about 64% of young Indian girls, they drop out before reaching 8th grade. So we can just imagine the situation. Despite having various rules and regulations, various acts against dowry and domestic violence, or against female infanticide, there are sex selective abortion taking place. There are the cases of dowry, there are the cases of domestic violence. Women are becoming the victim. But on the positive note, what we can say is that various organizations, they are working for the cause of the women, and also government is undertaking, like I have mentioned earlier, government is undertaking various activities for the empowerment of the women folk. The nature and the demand of women's movement in India were different in comparison with the present day demand and the nature, and obviously in the future days also, with the requirement of the time, the nature and the demand of the women's movement will obviously change. Having discussed about the women's movement in India so far, we can come to the conclusion that unlike the women's movement in America and in Britain, in India, women's movement was first initiated by the educated male section, and up to 1920s, the struggle was mainly carried on by main section only. It was only after Gandhiji's entry into Indian politics, women entered and involved in the movements and raised their voices. And now we have several kinds of women's movement which are fighting for their rights. So this is the entire scenario of women's movement in India. So in the first part, we have talked about the historical background of women's position in Indian society, and in this session we have talked about the different phases of women's movement in India. And I hope this entire lesson will act helpful to all the enthusiast minds, and especially to the students who have Sociology of India as their paper. And thank you to all the listeners for lending your ears for this lesson.